Welcome to this afternoon's American Security Project webinar. This is an on-the-record conversation that will be available for attribution. A recording of this conversation will be posted on our website. All audience members will be muted during the discussion, but please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions to the panelists. With that, Lindsay, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the fourth installment of ASP's Innovating Out of the Climate Crisis series. This program of events and papers is highlighting the innovations, challenges, and opportunities in 5 clean energy areas that are essential to pivoting away from fossil fuels. For today's discussion on innovation in agriculture, we're delighted to welcome Stephanie Mercier, a senior policy advisor from the Farm Journal Foundation and formerly chief economist of the Senate Agriculture Committee. Allison Thompson, the Ag Mission Program Director at the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research, and Renee Vassilos, Director of Agriculture Innovation at the Nature Conservancy. Thank you all so much for being here today. And I'm Lindsay Iversen. I'm an Adjunct Senior Fellow here at ASP. This series has already touched on some vast and complex issues, but I think that agriculture is among the most wide-ranging that we'll discuss. It produces the food we eat, the clothes we wear, even the fuel that drives our cars. But farmers and ranchers are also stewards of more than 900 million acres of the United States and much more of the world at large. The choices that they make at home and abroad can make an enormous difference to the quality of our environment today and our climate tomorrow. So in today's discussion, I want to start with just a little bit of scene setting about farming and the climate challenges that we'll face in the coming decades, before turning to the sources of and potential solutions to major agriculture pollutants, and finally look at how policy and market structures can help drive change. So it's just a small, narrow agenda that we'll be covering here in the next 45 minutes or so. I'll also be looking for your questions in the Q&A box, so please don't hesitate to put them there as we go along. So Stephanie, I'd like to start with you. I'm a city person. When city people think of farms, I think they tend to think sort of old McDonald's, you know, little farms, lots of animals. How well or how poorly does that vision really reflect modern U.S. agriculture? What sorts of farms are most common, but also what farms produce the most stuff?
Okay, well, so we still have mainly family-owned farms in the United States. According to the data that's collected by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, about 98% of all the farms in the United States are family-owned and operated. Some of them are pretty big and have hired labor, but they're still mainly family-owned and operated. But the very biggest ones, which account for roughly $1 million of revenue per year per farm, only accounts for about 5% of all farms, but account for about 65% of all production. So the numbers are pretty well dispersed, but the production is actually concentrated in a relatively small share of all farms.
Okay. Thank you. That was my sense, that there's this sort of big concentration at the top in terms of where things sort of come from.
And that's both large farms in terms of thousands of acres and crop farms, and also large livestock operations, both in that category.
Got it. Okay. Allison, when we think about climate change, to my mind, agriculture is sort of uniquely among industries vulnerable to changes in the climate. Can you talk a little bit about some of the biggest climate risks for U.S. farmers in the coming decades? And then maybe just a little bit give us a sense of, you know, in the developing world, are developing farmers going to be facing similar things, or will there be different challenges for them? Just to get a sense of the person.
Sure. And I think, I mean, like you say, farmers are uniquely vulnerable or sensitive to weather, right? And so they are very adaptable, in my experience, right? They know weather can be variable year to year, and they're used to having to make adjustments as the season goes on and weather changes. But I would say we're seeing 2 categories of things that are tied to climate. One is extreme events or disasters, things that are kind of outside the historical range, even for floods or things like extreme windstorms and things that cause immediate destructive damage crops in the field. That's happening more frequently. Things are stronger. They might be happening in different locations or times than they used to. So it's out of the norm, these extreme events, and farmers are having to take on that risk and deal with managing for those extreme events that are occurring. The other thing you're seeing is the more gradual change in things like earlier onset of the growing season. Right here on the East Coast, we're seeing that right now. Right, spring is at least 3 weeks ahead of schedule, according to my allergies. Right, so you're seeing things like that starting to happen. Earlier growing seasons, longer growing seasons, higher nighttime temperatures, and things like that. And what those are leading to is changes in how farmers think about the longer term of, okay, well, what am I going to be planting next year? You know, they think on this annual cycle of what they're planting each year, and that might be changing. We're seeing, you know, soybeans, for example, migrating northward. We're seeing less and less wheat grown in the US as some of these warmer season crops are moving north and displacing that wheat. So you're definitely seeing already the impacts of both the gradual change and the extreme change. I'd say that the main difference, and this is happening not just obviously in the US, but globally, other farmers are facing these same sort of dual challenges. The seasons are changing, what you can grow is shifting, and those extreme events, but they may have less ability to adapt, less capacity for adaptation because they have, you know, less access to, you know, insurance or other financial mechanisms to help them overcome those extreme events, you know, less access to the information and guidance or seeds for a different crop, right? Less access to make those adaptation changes. So really the difference is in that adaptive capacity. We have a relatively robust adaptive capacity here in the US, and it's still a challenge, I think, for farmers. And it's really forcing a shift in how they're thinking about planning for the future on their farms.
Got it. But when we think about agriculture in the US too, we need to think about agriculture as, you know, having climate change sort of visited upon it, but also as a contributor to climate change. Agriculture, I think, contributes about 10% of US emissions. Can you walk us through the most important sources of greenhouse gas emissions from US agriculture?
Yeah, great question. And there's great information available on this, right? The US does an inventory every year, so people can really dig into the numbers and see. I like to think about it in kind of different categories of, so there's the emissions that are within the control of an individual farmer or rancher or producer who's managing the land. And then there are emissions sort of embedded in the things that they're buying, right? They're buying fertilizer, they're buying seed, they're buying chemicals and so on. There's energy that's used to produce all of those things. But within the production system of what a farmer is doing on their land, interesting thing about agriculture is CO2 is not the dominant greenhouse gas, right? You've got methane from livestock, from enteric methane emissions, as well as from manure management, as well as from rice production, which is relatively small in the US, but we do have rice production here that emits methane, and that's obviously a bigger issue in other regions of the world with a lot of rice. So there's a lot of methane from agriculture and a lot of nitrous oxide as well. That's largely coming from soils as a result of use of fertilizers, nitrogen, carbon, nitrogen cycling in the soil. And the really challenging thing about those sources of emissions is that they're coming from natural processes that just occur as you're farming, right? You need to be growing plants, you need to be raising animals. But how can we manage those to reduce the overall increase in emissions that's coming from those? So, you know, we can manage the manure more efficiently, more effectively to reduce the emissions that are coming from the use of that, the storage of that, the handling of that. We can manage our nitrogen more efficiently on farm to, you know, just have greater nutrient use efficiency, less loss of nitrogen to the environment. So it's what can we do to manage these kind of natural systems and natural carbon nitrogen cycling processes that we can reduce those emissions. You do have carbon dioxide, of course, coming from farms, both from the energy used on the farm, right? You're running tractors, you're doing other things, pumping water that are using energy. So there are carbon emissions coming associated with that, as well as with the soils, you know, carbon emitted from the soils, and soils can then, of course, be used as for sequestration. So carbon can either be lost from the soil or gained into the soil, and it really depends on how much carbon input you're putting to the soil. So how much crop are you growing? What are you putting on that? What kind of organic amendments or other you know, straw or compost or other things you're putting on the surface of the soil? Cover crops are an addition of carbon to the system. And then how little can you disturb that? So the less you can disturb the soil and the more you can keep it covered with organic material growing ideally growing organic crops, the more carbon that you can store within that soil. And that is what helps to kind of get you to net zero. So you could say, okay, we may have some emissions of nitrous oxide because we are using fertilizer, but we're also able to manage our soils and sequester that and get the farm itself, or this area of land, close to zero emissions. So that's kind of what we're aiming for here within our program with Ag Mission, is looking to see what these farmers can do to get their own operations to net zero, because it is a very complex system to manage. It's very different than managing a factory or something like that, where you're just looking at the source of energy. That said, farmers can contribute to mitigation in the energy sector, both through converting to renewable sources of energy for the operations that they have, as well as producing energy on farms. I mean, I don't think we're going to go into that, but there's all sorts of potential opportunities to generate renewable energy on our farmland.
Yeah. No, thank you. And that sort of tees up the next series of questions that I wanted to sort of get into about ways that farmers can start to become part of the solution and tackle this. But one thing that I just wanted to linger on in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions, the difference in gas type is actually really important, right? So their impact on climate change, like so nitrous oxide and methane they enact more quickly on the atmosphere, right?
Yeah, so there's a lot of focus right now on methane in particular. Can we reduce methane emissions quickly? Because it has that shorter persistence in the atmosphere. So if you're able to reduce methane emissions, it will have a faster impact on our climate, on our overall global warming, the global warming potential. And so it will actually be a faster way to limit near-term warming. So you see a lot of focus on methane. Methane in agriculture is challenging because you're talking about, enteric methane from livestock and then the manure management. But it is a big focus and effort right now to see how we can reduce that. We have a program on that, doing research on cattle called the Greener Cattle Initiative. We also have a program we're starting up on fertilizer efficiency to try and start tackling that N2O problem as well. But there's still a lot of work that needs to be done on those.
Yeah. Thank you. So, Renee, I wanted to turn to you next to start off our conversation about some of the solutions. So, Allison just mentioned that there's ongoing research at her institution and in a wide variety of other places on advanced fertilizers. So one of the solutions that we can think about is changing our inputs, right? Changing our fertilizers. Can you talk briefly about one or two of the most sort of important innovations that you see in that space?
So we haven't, I would say the space is developing. We haven't seen anything that's like at commercial scale yet, but we are seeing there's a few companies out there that are working to develop alternatives to synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. So these would be organic replacements for synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. There are different companies. Kula Bio is one, Pivot Bio is another. They're using different, companies and using different technologies to get there. But the idea would be that I don't believe anyone is near 100% replacement for a synthetic nitrogen fertilizer needs, but they're getting, I think, in the range between 30 and 60%. So this wouldn't be a complete replacement, but it would be a partial replacement. And the idea is that in theory, and again, research is still being done, is that they tend to be a slow release. So it's also an opportunity to address some of the issues with runoff. That's an issue with synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. So that would be one area. The other area that's advancing that's interesting, I think, is the equipment space. So the other opportunity is just to become more efficient with what is already part of the system. So how can we actually be more efficient with the synthetic nitrogen fertilizers that are used? And I would say this is an equipment challenge. So how do we actually get equipment that allows farmers to profitably implement a precision fertilizer system, which will likely mean you're actually going into the field more often, not less often. And so that means if you don't have, and one of the challenges we see in agriculture is labor. And so one of the things that we get excited about is some of the autonomous equipment solutions that are being developed that are really working to create solutions that are cost effective for farmers to be able to implement these precision application systems. So one of the companies that we invested in is called Swarm Farm. It's an autonomous tractor platform based out of Australia that is looking to do exactly that. How can they support the profitable introduction of a precision application system?
So you've segued perfectly into the sort of first process solution that I wanted to talk about, which is precision agriculture. So I think that that might be that's a term that you've heard kind of bandied around, I think, for a number of years, right? And so can you I guess first sort of describe how should people think about precision agriculture? Is this, you've mentioned that it's sort of an equipment challenge, an equipment issue. What kinds of equipment do farmers using these systems sort of apply on their operations?
Well, so just maybe I'll address kind of just the general principle of it.
Please, yeah.
It's a lot like what folks are seeing in healthcare. So we're starting to see that we need to become more judicious about how we're using antibiotics. And it's a similar principle on farm, that we're recognizing that we have a very powerful suite of tools, but we need to be more careful about how and when they're applied. And so that's kind of the similar principle, that we're just getting sharper around how much and when to apply some of these tools on farm. And so that's kind of the idea, is that you're being more precise and efficient around your use of these tools. So that's fertilizers, that's insecticides, pesticides, herbicides. And so one of the challenges is that a system like that is actually more complex. What you're actually introducing is complexity. And so some of the challenges that we've seen is that the standard equipment doesn't necessarily allow for introducing that adaptive system. And so one of the things, again, that we think is interesting is a more adaptable, autonomous fleet of equipment that can be implemented can actually be used in a cost-effective way to actually follow through with a precision agriculture plan. So some of the constraints that we see with current equipment is the labor requirements. So labor, again, is just a tremendous issue on farm. Pretty much across the globe, small scale, large scale labor is a huge constraint. Yep. And then soil compaction is another issue that isn't talked about very much, but that's just another challenge. If you're imagining using some of the largest form equipment in a more complex, more often in the system, that can also lead to some real challenges on farm. So we're looking for solutions that can address some of those challenges in order to be able to implement. And the other critical piece is information. So it's using terrestrial data, drone imagery data, satellite imagery data to inform farm operators when they should actually be applying and how much. So the other piece of this is the data component, data that's actually turned into information for farmers to take action on. And you're seeing some companies that are working on that. Centera is one of those companies. They're based out of Minneapolis. They're gathering all of this data and working with ag retailers to actually provide it and support the on-farm action and shifts in how things are actually applied. So allowing for that.
You mentioned a term that I think is something that we'll come back to again and again over the course of this conversation, which is cost effectiveness. And one of the things that I think, particularly with precision agriculture, I think is so interesting is that, you would think that all the incentives would be aligned for farmers to run toward these technologies. They can use fewer inputs, they can use less labor, they can, there's all kinds of what would seem to be very economically advantageous reasons for farmers to use it. But even in the United States, where you have a highly capitalized, highly educated farmer base, they're not as widely adopted as well, at least as I won't speak for everyone, but at least as I might think. And so I wondered if, Renee, if you or if others have views on this as well, I'd be curious to hear what are the financial incentives that are both militating towards and against adoption of these kinds of technologies?
Oh, Stephanie, you have your hand.
Yes, Stephanie, go ahead.
So, I mean, most of the research that's looked at this has found that a lot of the equipment associated with precision agriculture does not cost effective except for the very largest farms. And the ARMS survey that the USDA runs, Ag Resource Management Survey, finds that a lot of the applications that are associated with precision ag are only used on a fairly small share of farms. The one that's most common, I think, is yield mapping, and partly it's
And what is yield mapping, just for folks that don't know?
so that allows a farmer to know. So say he's got a 160-acre field, it allows him to figure out what part of that field has the highest yield. Say that 10-acre slot in the center of his field has the best yields, but the ones along the edge of the farm, for example, which border along a creek, are less productive. So it gives him information to know where better to apply his inputs. So equipment costs are part of it. And Renee mentioned information. Another constraint is access to broadband in rural areas is lacking in some areas. And so the information that you can capture from precision ag is not necessarily optimal because you don't have access to the broadband internet speed that you need to use this stuff in real time. So there's a bunch of constraints out there. And the research that I've seen suggests that only that so far the very largest farms have been able to afford and benefit from the adoption of a lot of these practices.
Got it. I guess before we have a question that speaks to this issue just in the Q&A box, but to the extent that you guys have experience with this, are there precision techniques that apply or that can be applied in the developing world? Is this something that subsistence farmers or small scale farmers in poorer countries can use, or are we looking at these really being most relevant to the larger producers no matter where they are?
The concepts are applicable, but the equipment is simply not accessible. For example, there's an organization called 1 Acre Fund.
Yep.
Which operates which helps farmers, very small scale farmers, apply in very precise amounts both seed and fertilizer on farms. But they use very crude technology to do it. But they're sort of adopting the notion of precision agriculture, but not using a high-tech tractor with all the fancy add-ons like an American farmer would use. So the concepts can carry over, but the equipment costs are out of reach for all but the very largest farmers in developing countries.
Got it. Thank you. And thank you for the question. I want to move on to sort of the third approach that we're hearing more and more about in arable agriculture or farming, crop farming, which is something called, you'll often hear regenerative agriculture. So trying to skip or minimize fertilizers altogether and maximize the natural ability of the soils to provide for plant growth. So Allison, maybe I'll bring you in here. What are the techniques or technologies that farmers are using to achieve that goal?
Yeah, a good question. So what is regenerative agriculture is probably the first part of that question, right? It's a term that gets thrown around. It doesn't have a really, precise definition to it, but the way the concept has been evolving is it's agriculture done in a way that leaves the land improved from how it started. So you're actually improving the land through the process of farming rather than extracting, nutrients and carbon from the soil. And in order to produce a crop, you're actually farming in such a way that your system is bringing those back in and making it so that over time you need less inputs. And this is across the board, right? So over time you're improving the health of the soil, so that has a better water holding capacity. It has better nutrient cycling. You need less fertilizer and irrigation. You're producing a healthier plant that's less susceptible to disease. So you might need less input from chemical protectants, crop protectants, and things like that. That's the idea behind regenerative agriculture. There's competing definitions out there about what it is, but the idea is you're improving the system as you go. So I think it's a very worthy concept. There's a lot of folks out there experimenting with it. We have a lot of, I'd say the biggest challenge is we have a lot of great examples, right? There's a lot of really innovative advanced farmers out there doing, experimenting with their farms, really going for the regenerative agriculture, trying to, and being able to tell the great story of reducing their inputs pretty dramatically by doing that. But they're the minority, right? So this is the challenge, I think, in a lot of agriculture is how do we make that more the norm, right? How do you create a system that supports that as the normal thing for farmers to do rather than the exception? Because these are the people who are out there kind of bucking the trend and going all in. And that just has to do with a lot of the support structure for farmers in this country is set up the way it is, and it works, right, for farmers to continue operating as they have been. So you have to change that support structure, both in business and government and all of those things that are supporting farmers to be incentivizing the regenerative. So making that the normal option for farmers to adopt is the way we see things might need to be moving if we want to really make that mainstream agriculture, as opposed to just this novel thing that some farmers do, which is wonderful, but not going to make a massive difference to our aggregate greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture in this country.
Well, so, dive a little bit deeper there, then, if you don't mind. What when we think about sort of the system of support to farmers, the incentives that are in place, the policies, structures that are in place that sort of hold up agriculture today, uplift agriculture today, what are the top couple of things that would need to change to make these sorts of techniques more widespread?
I could probably answer anecdotally, but my fellow panelists might have a more specific answer for certain programs. But things like, our crop insurance program, farmers get compensated based on their historical average yield. So if they do anything that they're risking a yield loss, for example, that could impact not just their income this year, but their income for years to come. And so understanding that, if you're going in and asking them, I also like to keep in mind that we're asking them to change something that's an entire year of their income, right? It's not just what they do today. It's like what the decision they make about these practices affects their income for this entire year. And so you're asking them to take a big risk. And so how can you go in and help to share that risk with them? So I think there are people who have been really digging into policy-wise, what are the specific incentives potentially the government could address? I don't think I'm going to speak to those here because I don't have enough background on that. But as well as in sort of financial mechanisms, what are some of the more creative or flexible things that banks can do, right, when they're working with farmers to help share the risk of making some of these changes? And Renee and Stephanie may have things to add there.
Lindsay, I've been working with a group trying to strengthen the relationship between adoption and conservation practices and the benefits it can generate under the crop insurance program for several years. And one of the things that we've been working on over the last several months that kind of touches on what Allison mentioned is that one of the reasons why farmers are reluctant to adopt these conserving practices like cover cropping or no-till is that they're afraid that in the first years of adopting that practice is going to have an adverse impact on their yields. And that has a longer term effect because their crop insurance coverage is based on what is their history of yields on that land. And so what we've been exploring and discussing is, can we provide kind of protection in terms of that production history? It's called actual production history, or APH. So that if they adopt a new practice on a field, that they won't suffer harm on that APH as a result of adopting that practice. And that's something that we're exploring how to actually build into statutory language for the crop insurance program so that a farmer can protect that history while still exploring these new techniques and practices.
Interesting. Renee, I know that the Nature Conservancy has been doing a lot of work here.
Yeah, I guess Stephanie, we should connect offline. I wanted to share. So we're actually doing a pilot program with Growers Edge, that is a fintech company that we've invested in, and they're using warranties as a way to de-risk the adoption of new technology and these conservation practices. So we're doing a pilot with a warranty to guarantee yield outcomes for those for the producers that purchase this and then go ahead and plant a cover crop. So Stephanie, it sounds different than what you're thinking to work through core crop insurance. It's an alternative de-risking tool through this warranty mechanism. But we're very excited about it, and it will be kind of the second round of pilots this year. We're working through ag retailers to get those out to producers, in front of producers, and see who might be interested to actually use this as a way to de-risk the adoption of cover crops.
Fascinating. I want to, before we move on to animal agriculture, I just want to ask a couple more questions in this area and kind of bring us back to the why of why we would adopt these sorts of techniques. So the first we've talked the most about already is carbon sequestration, but carbon sequestration in farmland is actually really difficult to measure. Every acre, it seems like, is different, as any farmer will tell you. Every operation is different, and measuring, and ensuring permanence on farms can be quite challenging. So how should we think about or how are researchers, I should say, thinking about these kinds of measurements and permanence challenges? I don't know, Allison, I think that's something that you guys are working on a little bit, right?
Sure. Yeah, I can address this a bit. I mean, this is the big question right now, right? And there's a lot of people trying to figure this out. Can we make carbon markets in agriculture work so that soil carbon sequestration, we can add a price to that, and the private sector can take off and use that? And it's just really challenging, right? So I've been working in climate and agriculture for more than 2 decades now, and I will say that one of my first projects was a big government multi-million-dollar program on carbon sequestration. So it's not like there hasn't been investment in understanding carbon sequestration in agriculture, how to measure that using traditional and innovative techniques. This has all been going on for decades in the scientific realm. And really, the challenge is, like you say, soils are incredibly diverse, right? You can't observe them directly. The landscape is in the way. You have to get underneath and measure. They're incredibly diverse. They're very slow to respond, or can be slow to respond. They respond at different rates. There's the permanence issue. So even if you're able to sequester carbon and measure that over the next decade, the next person who comes along to farm that land could release that carbon, or the climate could change in such a way that carbon is released. So those things scientifically are interesting to study, but when you take it over to the private sector kind of market space, they become barriers to a market, right? Because it's okay, well, we don't know. If we're not buying something that's permanent, that's certain to be there and that we know is permanent, then we have to discount that. And so the cost or the value of that carbon goes down. And right now, I think what I see, and I'm not an expert in this, in the market side of it, but the way I think of it is either the cost of measurement and understanding the carbon has to come way down, or the value of carbon has to go way up for these to work in that system, right? So right now it's just not balancing out. So you see people doing creative things like stacking additional credits. So you say you have a soil carbon credit, but you also get a water quality credit and a biodiversity credit for some of the practices you're doing. You see that approach. Maybe that gets to the level where then farmers are incentivized to make a practice change that achieves all of those multiple goals together. Because I would say the one thing we do know is, even if there's this uncertainty about is it there, how long is it there, can we base a market on it? We know that the practices you do for soil carbon sequestration improve soil health, and that's beneficial across the board, right? In terms of both your soil fertility and your resilience to climate stresses, as well as for things like soil biodiversity, for water quality. So there's multiple co-benefits. So there's no reason not to. We just may not be able to attach like a direct financial payment to that carbon stock right now. So it's a really tricky space, and there's we are doing some research in this as well from far side. We're working with Ohio State University on a large program to look at carbon sequestration at the farm scales, actually taking it out to producers' fields, doing measurements and chronosequence studies to see changes over time in carbon sequestration at that field scale, because field scale can behave very differently from a university plot or greenhouse study or things like that. So we're really trying to take it into the farms and get a better base of data. Because one of the things that will help reduce uncertainty is just more information from more sites, more diverse locations, more diverse systems, more real world cases. The more data we can build up in that, the better all of the tools trying to do this will be. So we're trying to help out with that specifically right now through our program with Ohio State.
Great. And you mentioned something that I think is really important that we haven't really dived into yet. at all, which is just sort of not just the carbon sequestration benefits, but also the broader environmental co-benefits of some of these soil management practices in terms of water quality and biodiversity and things like that. But I know that we have about 10 more minutes. And so I want to make sure that we ask at least a few questions about animal agriculture and policy as well. So I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and move us past that, but I just wanted to touch on it because it is just so important. So I think as we're kind of thinking about one of the biggest methane producer, as we've talked about before, is cattle and other ruminants, where they produce methane as a byproduct of their natural digestion. Stephanie, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about some of the ways that scientists are working to address this particular problem. I've heard of genetic modifications to cattle microbiomes. Is that right? Like, walk us through some of the more exciting innovations there.
Well, there's a couple ways to tackle this, Lindsay. One is is kind of basic. The productivity of ruminant animals is quite variable around the world.
Yep.
And that you're getting more methane emissions from ruminants like cattle and water buffalo and other kinds of animals in developing countries because their productivity is low. They have much bigger herds. So that if we can help those countries through genetics, through artificial insemination, or just introducing better stock into their livestock herd, you can improve their productivity and reduce the livestock number. So that's kind of basic. You don't really need a lot of research to do that. You just need to invest the resources to help them improve the genetics of their herds. The more sophisticated and stuff that still needs a lot of research is what can be done to reduce methane emissions by the animals. And one path that's being explored is, can we genetically modify animals so they have lower methane emissions per animal? Modify that composition of the microbes that are in the rumens of these animals so that they're more efficient in converting the food without having quite such high methane emissions as part of the byproducts. Another path that's being explored are feed ingredients. Are there feed ingredients that you can add, or things like? And one thing that's been explored is there's apparently these kinds of seaweed, which if fed to livestock reduce the methane emissions. And I think these are very early and all in the research stuff, but it's very promising work. A bunch of approaches that are being taken, and frankly, we need to invest more in all of them.
Yeah. So one of the things that you touched on at the end was R&D, and some of that comes from the federal government. As I was researching ahead of this event, I found myself in an alphabet soup of USDA programs and projects and funding sources and to help farmers adopt better practices and to help researchers develop them. So Stephanie, you worked at the Farm Journal Foundation on a really useful report on the way that the federal government is supporting some of the conservation adoption techniques. So I wondered if you could talk about maybe what you see as the most important, and then one of the sort of common threads, which we picked up on a little bit in our preparation for this conversation, was that so many of them are voluntary. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about why that is.
Okay, so there are what we call working land conservation programs, which are funded through the Farm Bill that are offered to farmers who get payments, technical assistance, and financial assistance to help them adopt these new conserving practices. And there are things like we've talked about, no-till, cover cropping. There's a whole range of practices that are eligible for this assistance. They are funded at about $2.5–3 billion a year, at least under the last the 2018 Farm Bill. The Inflation Reduction Act, which was passed last year, added roughly $19 billion over the next 5 years to those programs, and so there'll be additional funding available for those programs. They're considered voluntary programs because there's a great reluctance on the part of the House and Senate Agriculture Committees, which are the chief architects of farm bills, to impose requirements on having to do with conservation on farmers. And they're much very, very inclined to offer assistance to farmers who are willing to adopt them, but very reluctant to impose requirements on farmers in these areas. And so that's why this is a long tradition in farm bills to go this path, and there would be very strong resistance in both farming communities and, frankly, the House and Senate Ag committees to go a different route on this.
Renee, I'd like to come to you. One topic that we have sort of been dancing around a little bit is the role of startups in the agriculture landscape. To me, I think of agriculture as this very concentrated, corporate-dominated industry. You know, I mean, with the big four seed companies control, what, 85% of the U.S. market or something. So, you know, you've got a long background in startups. TNC is doing some terrific work with some ag startups. How do they fit into this space? What do you see as their role?
Yeah, well, connecting to what you were just referencing on the government side, there was just recently, Stephanie probably knows the numbers, but I don't know all the numbers. There was a very large set of climate smart commodities grants awarded. And so these were for companies and organizations that are doing work to try to, or that are experimenting and doing work to try to profitably scale conservation adoption. And if you looked at the companies, some of the companies that received the grants, I think you would see a lot of venture-backed companies. So the venture investment space is playing a very important role to create, frankly, some competition for those industry incumbents, where we finally are fostering some non-traditional ideas and technologies. And so I would argue the venture community plays a very important role in creating and supporting some of these solutions that, again, will help facilitate the cost-effective implementation. That's what I would say remains one of the challenges, that it's just not profitable to necessarily implement these practices yet. And so we've got to get to a place where the technology exists for farmers to adopt these practices and keep running profitable operations. So I would say the venture community is very important for that, for not just creating the solutions, but also just generally putting some pressure on industry incumbents. You know, they don't have very much competition. So even a small startup, you know, that has an idea and is creating an interesting solution can be putting some pressure onto that kind of very uncompetitive system. So I would argue it's a very important space. Another example, one of the companies in our portfolio is Farm Raise, and they're creating a platform to facilitate farmers that haven't had access to those payments to support conservation practices. Most of those dollars go to the very large farms that Stephanie mentioned in the beginning. They've created the platform to support some of the smaller and middle-sized farms to actually be able to access those payments. So there's a lot of complementary technology and innovative solutions that I think are working really in tandem with some of the government investments, and certainly they're focused around scaling the conservation practices, at least, of course, the companies that we've looked at, but then we have a bias towards that. Sure. But we're just seeing that more and more are recognizing that that is core business, that needs to be how you're thinking about starting a business that's going to be profitable. Is it has to facilitate profitable, sustainable farms, which Allison touched on it. Those are regenerative farms. They are more resilient and are in a better shape to combat climate change. And so as you're thinking about introducing a business into that system, you need to be able to support those types of farms.
Yeah.
Sorry, Lindsay. Yeah. So the climate smart commodities is a kind of an interesting approach that USDA has taken, and I should say up front that Farm Journal Foundation is involved in a couple of the projects that got approved, and they're looking at not just generating carbon offsets for our carbon or ecosystem services market, but also trying to establish a consumer product. For example, if it's beef that's produced in a climate smart way, you label it that way in a store, and you give consumers an opportunity to contribute, to buy into the effort to generate more of that kind of product in the market. So that's a very important part of what USA is trying to do, is is to create the basis for not just building up carbon markets, but also markets for identity preserved commodities, which have this attribute is that they're produced using climate smart practices.
Right. So that actually touches on one of the closing lightning round questions, which I'll come to in just a moment. But there's a question in the Q&A that I wanted to sort of surface. You know, the average age of the American farmer, I think, is now over 60, maybe approaching 65. And so in the coming years, there's going to be a real shift in ownership to a new generation of farmers. Do you see this transition as sort of an opportunity? Is there greater interest among younger farmers who are maybe already working on the family farm, but not in control of the family farm? How does that generational change play out? And are you seeing any of that in any of the work that you're doing with farmers on the ground?
I'll say yes, I think it does make a difference. You know, I think you do see the younger generation more interested in experimenting and trying novel things and more comfortable with the different decision support tools that are out there, right? Some of the high level technology stuff that Renee was talking about, some of the, you know, farmers who've been around for a long time aren't so keen to try and learn a whole new system, where some of the newer ones are. I think it's a challenge, though. Not necessarily all of those farmers who retire are going to be handing the reins over to the next generation, right? Who's actually going to be farming that land once they retire? How land gets allocated for farming in this country is very challenging. I think it's very difficult to get into farming, right? If you weren't born into owning the land, right? Access to land to farm is incredibly difficult to come by. It's incredibly expensive, and the value is just going up as people invest in farmland. So that's a big challenge. But I think, yes, overall, if you have a younger cohort of farmers, they're going to be more interested in experimenting with some of the more novel and different systems and some of the more complex financial arrangements around carbon.
Yeah, I mean, succession is a huge issue for farming.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sorry. Succession is a huge issue for farming because not every, even family farms, have a next generation who's willing to stay on the farm and continue working. We work with a group of about 35 farmers at Farm Journal Foundation, and I would say probably only half of them have younger generations on the farm working and ready to take over when the older farmer retires. And in fact, we had a dairy farmer that we work with in New York, and there's my cat, who it just sold his farm because his son decided to leave the business.
Yep.
So that it's a huge issue, not just for the sort of the conservation minded aspect of it, but for the continuity of farming operations.
Yeah.
So, Lindsay, if I could just say
Yeah.
I don't know if compliment's the right word. The other piece driving that is that then you're also starting to see, based on what Stephanie and Allison just shared, more institutional investors coming in and actually managing land. So greater volumes of acres are under institutional management. These folks are not only, of course, trying to turn a profit from what's happening on farm, but they're also accountable to financial stakeholders. And so we're seeing that those folks are driving more of this interest and focus on regenerative resilient systems. So that is actually, I think, quite exciting piece that we're starting to see. And then, yeah, so that's just an interesting piece.
Yeah, it kind of runs counter to what you'd think. Okay, so we're actually a little bit over time, but I want to take 1 minute for just a final lightning round and ask, you know, if the audience can take away one fact or one insight or one lesson learned about climate and US agriculture, what would you want them to go home with from this set of issues? What do you want them to know?
Well, my takeaway would be that farmers are interested and willing to adopt these practices, but they need incentives to do so. The core ones who are early adopters, that's already built into place. So they're doing the work and leading by example. But you've got a large percentage of farmers who are still cautious on this. They're interested, but they don't want to undermine the profitability of operations, and so they're going to need incentives either through public sector programs or private sector markets or incentives to take that step.
And I would maybe jump in and say that for the last, well, I think Stephanie said you were working, or Allison said 20 years you've been working in this space, but for those 20 years, it's been a lot of headwinds trying to drive this. And I would say there's now some tailwinds supporting around this shift, some of which are that the status quo solutions just aren't working. So herbicide resistance, pesticide resistance, what Allison hit on around climate change issues, the volatility in weather is really impacting and not allowing for the status quo solutions to actually work. So I'm excited that we now have more tailwinds that are driving a lot of the efforts towards scaling these practices.
Yeah,
That's exciting.
I would
Note
build
of
on that as-
optimism.
yeah, I would say
Yeah.
yes, definitely to the tailwinds, but also, you know, the main takeaway for me would just be that farming in this country is not, it is a very complex and very high tech endeavor at this point in time. And so farmers are very highly educated and very working. There's a lot of opportunities, I guess I would say, to get involved in farming and agriculture from every angle. And it is really one of the critical things that we need to solve for climate changes in this space. So just saying there's enormous amounts of opportunity in very high tech fields to work in agriculture on this.
Wonderful. Well, thank you to this terrific panel for a wonderful conversation. Thank you to the audience for your many questions. I apologize that I wasn't able to get to all of them. You'll be able to see the video and transcript on ASP's website soon. But in the meantime, thank you again for joining us this afternoon, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.